I am working on Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Press 140 pound watercolor paper this time. And I actually took a big scratch piece. This was a piece I cut off another project. It was just extra paper, which worked perfectly for the composition I wanted for these roses. So I'm starting with the green of the stem and leaves. I'm using multiple shades of green. And this is like everything else where you just want to look at it in terms of abstract shapes. Don't worry too much about this doesn't look like the stem of a rose. It will once everything comes together. So don't freak yourself out if something doesn't look like what you think it should look like just yet. Blending that out with the Mona Lisa odorless mineral spirits or paint thinner, whatever. You guys know what it is. Now, if you don't have access to the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, the Gamsol works exactly the same. I actually used the Gamsol for the middle rows on this piece just to test out, and it worked exactly the same. I didn't notice any real difference in dry time or how it looked or the results that I got. So I know that's one that's available for a lot of you who are outside of the US. It costs a little bit more, but it's easier for you to get. According to the bottle, they claim that it is one of the more non-toxic mineral spirits or paint thinner type things that you can use, but only if used as directed, which seemed like a really odd little disclaimer in there. Now, I'm not putting too much crazy detail in these leaves in the background because they are slightly out of focus. So as always, I've got 3 to 4 or 5 layers of colored pencil down on any given area before I start blending out with paint thinner. If you don't have enough layers of colored pencil on that paper, when you blend with paint thinner, it doesn't look like a whole lot happens. So you want to make sure that there's a lot of pigment on that paper before you blend so that it actually does what it's supposed to do. But if you find that you did not have enough layers on the first few goes before you blend it out with paint thinner, you can always let it dry and just add more layers. It's not like you've ruined anything by blending too soon. Remember to work with a fairly light hand. You don't want to push hard because it'll ruin the tooth of the paper, which will limit how many layers you can apply. Now, if you look at this, I mean, they don't look like leaves or stems or anything. They're just abstract shapes, and it's just so much easier to look at it that way to get very accurate results. If you need to, you can work upside down, although I find working upside down when you're drawing flowers doesn't work quite as well because they look good upside down too, or they still look like flowers that way. But give it a try and see if it helps. Now, one of the things that you may notice when I work, my work is always in the same position. I'm not turning it sideways or upside down. You can't see me moving it as I work. It's only because I'm recording. If I weren't recording, I would be turning this paper constantly, side to side, over on the edge, all over the place, so that I could work my hand in the most comfortable position for any area that I'm working on. So don't feel like you have to keep it in one position all the time. You can see my hand is further back on these pencils because I'm not pushing very hard. When I get to where I'm burnishing, I will usually hold my hand a little bit closer towards the front of the pencil. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how hard I'm pushing on the pencil based on where my hand is located. So you can see I've still got that grainy, gritty look on that first layer. So I'm going to let that dry and I'll end up coming back over again. But while that dries, I'm going to work on another area. Now, the nice thing with drawing flowers, and this is one of the reasons that I start a lot of beginning students off on flowers, they are really forgiving. If you have a petal in the wrong place, a leaf in the wrong place, no one is going to know the difference when it's done. As long as you're kind of close, seriously, no one's going to know. So it's really easy to make them look very good and very, very realistic if you're not as strong on your drawing skills yet. And they're great practice for blending because you not only do you have all the detail that you can get in there, but you've got a lot of blending the same way that you'll end up doing on skin tones, but on a rose or any flower, it's going to be, like I said, a lot more forgiving. Now, when I draw roses or even landscapes, anything like that, I don't waste too much time worrying about every last little line being exact. I go for close because, again, no one's going to notice the difference. If I'm doing a portrait or an animal, I'm going to be paying a lot more attention to those finer details and spend more time on that. But on a rose, I can move through it fairly quickly because it really doesn't matter if something's slightly off. So really, any medium that you're wanting to get started in, if it's a medium you've not done before, I strongly recommend drawing flowers. It may seem boring. I know not everyone thinks that's the most exciting thing ever, but your results, you're going to learn what you need to, the same as you would drawing something like an animal or a person, something more advanced, but you're going to be a little bit happier with the results because it's not as frustrating when something doesn't look quite right. You can see lots more layers here. Now this rose, or these 3 roses, I took the photos myself. I just went to the grocery store, picked up a bouquet of roses, pulled a few out of it, and I got a big, huge piece of white paper. It's a piece of Bristol vellum that I no longer really work on. So I used that paper, took it outside, laid it up against the wall. So part of it was up going vertical and part was laying flat on the floor, and I put the roses there, and it made for some really good reference photos. So if you're looking for an easy way to get good photos yourself, that definitely worked. You can see I switched to a much smaller brush for blending out the little details. And that one was a flat brush. I like the flat brushes for the tiny details more so than the filberts. The filberts I like for the larger areas because it's easier to avoid with a filbert having brush strokes show. On small areas, it really doesn't matter. And the small areas, that little flat brush gets cleaner edges. Now, if you're going to leave your background white like this, you need to be really, really careful not to smudge the work. And there was an area on this that I did smudge a little bit towards the end on the last rose. So I am not going to sell this piece because of that. I covered it up. It looks fine in photo, but when I look at it in person, I can see that I've got white colored pencil on part and not the other. So I'm going to end up using this as a gift for a family member for Christmas or maybe her birthday, because she's not going to notice the difference. But you do want to really watch because it is so easy to accidentally smudge the work. So here I've got a piece of glassine underneath my hand. This is a non-stick type acid-free paper that I did get a little lazy at one point and wasn't keeping it all the way under my hand, and it showed. You really want to keep something under your hand anyway, even if you're not worrying about smudging, because you don't want the oils from your hand on the paper. That's not very healthy for it, archival-wise. Now, I've got all of the colors that I listed below in the video description, but you don't have to use this many colors. As long as your values are right or close, you should be fine. Remember, a great way to keep your colored pencils sharpened between actually sharpening them in a pencil sharpener is to use a piece of sandpaper. And they sell these little strips of sandpaper that are on a hard surface, so they're just so easy for holding and sharpening your pencils that way. But it'll help your pencils to last a lot longer. I have the full set of Polychromos that I bought back in, I believe it was February or March of 2014. I've only had to replace the black. I've replaced a few other ones just as backup in case I run low, because you can't just run to a local art store to replace them as needed like you can with Prismacolor. So I do have backup pencils here, but the only ones that I've actually used all of was the black. The rest of the pencils I still have so much left of. So while the pencils may seem very expensive to invest in at first, they really do last a long time. But sharpening the tips on sandpaper will help them to last even longer. Now that one is the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. I really like that pencil for burnishing white or lightening areas, as long as I don't need fine detail. You can see that the tip of that pencil, or the core, is really thick, and the pencil lead is so soft that it burns down really quickly. So it's hard to keep a fine point on that. It's great for larger areas. When I need small detail, then I'll switch over to my Luminance White. I love the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. I used it for the first time on my flamingo recently, but it's definitely not a replacement for the Luminance. I feel like it's a great addition to, though. Definitely now on my must-have list. I've not tried any of the other Derwent drawing pencils, so I'm not sure how those would work. But someone recommended that Chinese White, and it really is amazing. If you're going to order them, though, I recommend ordering several. I only ordered 2, and I wish I would have ordered at least 10, because I am going through it quickly. Even though I didn't use it that much, you really do burn through it fast. So when you look at these, again, it just looks like abstract shapes. It doesn't really look like leaves. If I didn't tell you there were leaves, you might not even notice that that's what all these lines and shapes were. But you just want to get used to copying your reference photo closely. And again, this goes back to one of the reasons that I think drawing roses or flowers in general is such good practice. There's so much detail in there, so you're really getting a good grip on paying attention to little detail. But if you miss some of the little detail, no big deal. It'll still look pretty when you're finished. If you miss some of that little detail on a portrait, you may have some troubles. Now, most of the brushes that you see me blend with come from a set. Hobby Lobby carries them. It's like a round tube. It's $9.99, and then, of course, you can use your 40% coupon on it. But it has several of these Taklon. They're white Taklon bristled brushes. They've got rounds and flats and filberts and all sorts of brushes in there. There's a few that I don't use, that there's no point for this anyway, but there's so many in that set that they're really good. I usually have most of my students pick up one of those sets for blending in colored pencil. But if you do not have a Hobby Lobby near you, I'm just using golden Taklon or white Taklon bristled brushes in filberts, flats, and rounds. One thing you want to watch for, you don't want your brushes to be too big, because that's going to make it really hard to control. You also don't want the bristles to be too long. If they're too long, they bend a lot as you're working, and so they're just not ideal. So the shorter bristled brushes definitely work best here. Moving on to the rose, I am starting on the outside of this petal with a base color of burnt ochre 10%. It's just a light sort of peach color. And I'm going to cover the whole outside area of that rose. When you look at it, you may think that that portion is just white, but it's not. If you use Photoshop, you can use an eyedropper tool to check your colors, but it's really not white at all. There is very, very little white in these roses. So I'm just going to, with a light hand, go ahead and fill that in. Now, I talked about how long the Polychromos last. The Luminance pencils, I burn through a little bit faster than them, being that they are a softer wax-based pencil, but I've still only replaced the whites. I believe all the rest of them are still my originals. I'm getting low on my violet gray because I also use that on all of my pieces. But they still last a really long time. Not as long as the Polychromos, but still pretty long. So now I'm blending that out with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. Being that this is a larger area, I'm going to switch over to my golden Taklon bristled filbert brush. Once that dries, I'm taking my Derwent Drawing Chinese White and burnishing this over some of that. It gives me a nice smooth look and lightens it up. Now, I knew I could let that base petal go, or the back there, be quite a bit darker than my end result should be, because I knew I would go on top of that with the white, which smooths it out, gives me a nice surface, and just pulls the two colors that I started with together. Now we've got some green veining in there. Now the veins in the rose, I did not put too much crazy detail in. I threw some of them in, but I didn't really want that to be the focus of the rose, so I went kind of light on those. I wanted the focus to be the center of the rose, and if I put too much detail on the veining on the outside petals like that, it would have drawn attention to the wrong area. So I just kept those veins very light. When you're working, you want to remember you've got to constantly be thinking about where you want the viewer's attention to be. Just because your reference photo has a lot of detail in any given area, that doesn't mean you necessarily need to put all of that detail in that spot. Now the majority of the detail work done on the inside of these roses, I stuck with the Polychromos because they do get to such a fine point. So with all that little detail, it made it really easy to keep everything clean. Now when you're drawing flowers, when you're first getting started, I recommend do one little petal at a time, or one curve of a petal at a time, versus trying to block in red for the whole center of the flower and then add your detail or build up. While I do build up that way often, when you're starting, it is so much easier just to break it down to one little area at a time. And with flowers, because it's such clear-cut areas, like the one petal, it's so easy to see where it starts and stops. It makes it really easy to work that way. And it's definitely easier to keep track of where you are versus layering like this color. I could have put it over most of the inside and worked my way out, but it would have made it a lot harder to keep my place. I'm using multiple shades of pinks, reds, and oranges for this. You can see the color that I've got on this petal is slightly darker than what I'm going to end up leaving it as, but I need to go this dark so that I can come back on top with my white. Now, every type of rose, you've got so many different variations, but on this one, it's got a very ruffled look for the edges. So you want to make sure when you're drawing a rose or any flower, pay attention. Are those edges smooth, very, very smooth, straight lines, or are they going to be bumpy and ridged like these ones are? That sort of detail will make a big difference in your end result. You can see I'm doing a lot of shading before I blend with the paint thinner. It's not as obvious until I go over it with the paint thinner because it almost looks like all the colors I've got in there are pretty much the same. But I've got a lot of the darks and the lights all in there at once. And they will all be much more obvious once I go over that with the paint thinner. I'm mixing this brown in to get the really dark portions of the rose. There are some areas that I will use black, but not a lot. The majority of the darkest points in here are a deep rose or a deep red, almost brick red color, and that brown. And all of the places that I did put black, I went on top of it with that dark red color so that the black wasn't flat. I know a lot of people will tell you don't ever use black in your work, whether you're painting or drawing. I love using black, but I do layer colors on top of it just so that that gives it a bit more depth and they're not going to end up being flat. But I like my darks to be really dark, and I don't care how many colors you mix, they're not going to come out as dark as what you can buy in a black pencil or black paint, especially if you're mixing colors on top of it. It just gives you such a nice, rich, deep color. Plus, it saves a lot of time. So I've got this orange color. That is a Luminance. That one is called Scarlet. It looks more orange to me than it does actual red, but it gives just this nice glow to the flowers, and I used that a lot. My reference photo, my flowers weren't so orange. They had more of a purpley magenta color, but this color just gave it such a gorgeous glow that I continued through all three flowers using that. So I pulled my reference photo so that everything was more orange instead of the magenta that the flowers actually were. So you can see as I get into these smaller areas, I'm back to looking at it as abstract shapes, just copying my reference photo where the lights and the darks go. I'm not looking at it as a flower petal at all anymore once I get into these little areas. Now, none of the petals that I have here are finished. What I do is I work like every other colored pencil piece you guys have seen me do. I get everything mostly done. I block in where my lights and my darks go. And then once everything's mostly in there, I'm going to come back through and start refining detail, hyping up contrast. If you don't like to work that way, you can work until any given area is completely 100% done before you move on. That is completely up to you, but it's one of those things as artists, all our brains work a little bit differently, and so you've got to figure out what works best for you. I'm using that Derwent Drawing Chinese White to pull out some of the highlights on the white portion of that petal. Now I call it white because technically that area, when you looked at the flower in person, it was very white, but it's got the reflection of the red on the petal above it. The inside of all of these petals was red, and so that reflection is making it look very pink, which goes back to what I've talked about before with white. White is rarely straight white. It picks up so many of the colors behind it, and here is especially true. So you can see I'm using the white Luminance pencil for the teeny tiny little details. Now, one of the things that you're seeing me do a lot, I'm taking some of the Luminance pencils. I've got different pinks. This one is, I can't even begin to say that. Something very long that starts with an A, pink. That one is a pretty opaque pencil, and so it shows up really well against the darker reds that I already have down. Now, if I were to do this just with Polychromos, I wouldn't work that way. I would start by leaving the light areas light and work the darker areas around it. Because the Luminance are so translucent, you're not going to get the opaque colors on top very much. So the type of the pencil you're using will make a little bit of a difference on the way that you want to lay your pencil down. If using Polychromos, always start with the lightest colors you need and slowly darken up. And that's generally going to be the case with colored pencil anyway, but you can get away with doing it the other way around sometimes with the Luminance because so many of the colors are opaque. But you'll want to test that. I always have a scratch piece of paper next to me so I can test what those results might be when I layer things in a certain way. Because if you layer two colors, like if you're trying to mix purple and you would just use red and blue, if you put the red down first and the blue on top, it's going to be very different than if you put the blue down first and the red on top of that. So you want to test it out before you hit your actual project to avoid any disasters. And if you only have one set of the pencils, whether it be Prismacolor, Polychromos, Luminance, you can definitely complete this and have it look pretty much exactly the same just with one set. You don't need the two sets. It's easier absolutely easier for me to mix the two, but it can be done with just one. So don't feel like you won't get results the same if you don't have both. Although if you are working in Prismacolor, you're going to have a way harder time getting the little detail inside the rose, just because they don't like to hold a fine point as well as the Luminance or the Polychromos. Now the nice thing here with working in the sections like I am, once one section is done, or while I'm waiting for it, I've blended it out with a paint thinner and I'm waiting for it to dry before I can put the next layer over it, I can work on another petal. So it's one of the reasons that you'll see me jump around quite a bit. A lot of the time, I'm just waiting for one area to dry from the paint thinner. Now, how long that's going to take to dry just depends on how much paint thinner I applied to the paper. The type of paper that you use will also make a bit of a difference. I know the Stonehenge, because it's a softer paper, the paint thinner really soaks into it, and it takes forever. Well, it seems like it takes forever to dry. And while I often use the hairdryer to dry things when I'm working in Inktense or with acrylic paints, I would not do that here because paint thinner is flammable. So I would keep heat away from it. It's best to just let it air dry on its own. So here, as I get into the little areas, I like to get my darker areas blocked in first. That way I can take my lighter pencils and just go right over them without worrying about losing that mark. Now, one of the complaints that I hear people make a lot about using paint thinner is they feel like it dulls the color. It does initially, but that's because you're not finished. You're just going to keep layering until your color ends up being as rich as you want it. The thing with the paint thinner is because you're not damaging the tooth of your paper in order to blend, you can just layer on top of layer on top of layer until you get the color saturation that you want. The exception to that, I find, is working on Bristol vellum. When I work on vellum, I'm much more limited and I have a really hard time getting the color saturation that I want. It's just too smooth and I can't get enough layers on there no matter how light I work. That's not to say Bristol vellum is the wrong paper to use, it's just wrong for me and the way that I work. But everything seems fairly dull, especially when using paint thinner on that paper. With the Fabriano Artistico, it's still smooth, but it has just enough tooth that I can just keep layering and getting my color as rich as I want. The Stonehenge is the same thing. I'm able to get my color saturation exactly how I want on that as well. I've had a lot of people ask me about working on colored tone paper like black paper. I don't like it, and that's because you can never get your whites white enough. It doesn't matter how opaque your white pencil is, it is never going to be white enough. And a lot of times you'll see online where people posted pictures that they did working on black paper, and they're beautiful. But what you don't realize is usually they're hyping up the contrast when they take the photo, whether they're doing it intentionally or the camera's doing it automatically to make the blacks really black and the whites light. It's just they don't look quite as vivid as they do online. So when working in colored pencil, I find it to be best just stick with white paper so that everything, your whites, you have the option to keep everything very light. Now, black paper, if I were going to use that, because I do have a pad here that one of these days I should play with. I bought it years ago. But I think for white charcoal, then it looks great because the white charcoal really looks amazing up against that black paper. But when you want your colors and colored pencils to be very bold, sticking with white, you're going to have more control of the colors that you end up with. I did work on a fawn Stonehenge paper recently. I wanted to test that out. I used it for my black leopard, and that one worked okay for getting the colors that I needed because I didn't need any true whites on that one. But after I use up the paper that I bought with that, and I think I've got enough to do like 8 pieces with it, but I probably won't repurchase anything but white. It was harder for me to judge my values working against that as well. And that's something you can probably get used to, but I just don't see the reason. I was just happier with working on white paper. You can see I'm taking this rose color and I'm going right over the light areas. I'm going over the light and the dark areas, and what's happening is it's pushing together both of those colors so that it's not so distinct between my highlights and my shadows. It just pulls everything together, so it's very similar to glazing. When I do that, I'm going to always do that, almost always do that, I should say. There's always exceptions, but I'm almost always going to use my Polychromos when I do that, where it's more like glazing because it is so translucent. So Polychromos are great for that technique. So you can see, finally, all of these abstract shapes are starting to look sort of like a rose. When you work on something that has a lot of tiny detail like that, I recommend backing away a lot and looking at it from a distance, or just looking across the room. Give your eyes a break. If you stare at this much tiny detail, not that much tiny detail has happened yet, but it will. When you stare at it for too long, you start to lose sight of what it is that you're doing. It's harder to judge your values. It's harder to see the detail. You just stare at this little area too long. One of the things that I used to do a lot was keep a TV going in my studio, so I would constantly look across the room. It would give your eyes that bit of a break to look at a distance versus being so up close to your work like this. Just a lesson in eye health care. Back in 98 or 99, when I first decided this is what I wanted to do for a living, when I had my eyes checked, they gave me a prescription. I did definitely need contacts or glasses at the time. And I went back a year later for my checkup, and my prescription had more than doubled in that year. That was a bit alarming. And what had happened, they had to sit down and we had to go through what I did every day to figure out what was causing it. And they decided it was because of the artwork. When I work, I tend to work with my face right up against the paper or the canvas. Not so much since I started recording, because I don't want my head in the camera, but because I was working so close all the time and I would work hours on end without taking a break, I was causing a lot of damage to my eyes. And so the doctor had me start doing exercises where while I was working, I have to constantly look up across the room. Looking at the TV helped, looking at anything, looking at a photo across the room, but it's something, the way your eyes, I don't know all the scientific details about it, but it made a difference. And now my eyes rarely change year to year. But that first year where I was doing so much art and working up so close to my canvas without ever looking away, I did a lot of damage to them. So definitely, as you're working, when you work up close to something like this, just give your eyes a break, look across the room. Now for me now, because I don't print out my reference photos anymore, I work from a computer monitor. I am already having to look across the room or look away from my work. So that definitely helps as well. So here, there's so much little detail. I used a darker pencil, lined in all of the actual lines, and then just lightly went over it. I don't do that for most of the rows, but here, because it's just this teeny, teeny, tiny detail, it was easier for me to shade this way. And so now I can come through with my darker pencil. You can see it's very, very sharp. And I am going to start adding my shadows on top of all of these little areas. And the closer I got into the center of the rose, the less exact I was, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, here you're just, those lines need to curve and just sort of overlap each other, like a cabbage. So you can see I've used a bit of black, and that black is, it's very dead, it's very flat. But then I'm going to come right on top of it with the red, and what it's doing is making my, it's still red, but it's such a deep dark red, but it's not flat. When I blended that, I just went right over that whole section. It's very messy. I can still see my general shapes. I'm going to let that dry, and then I can come through and start refining everything. Now the two darkest colors that you're seeing me use here, the Polychromos, it is the dark red, and the Luminance dark color that I'm using is so hard to read on these. It's something brown. That's helpful, isn't it? Perylene brown, I believe that says. That writing is super tiny. That is one thing I would like to see changed on Luminance pencils. I would love if the labels were a little bit easier to read. But all of those darks, both of those pencils really do get very, very dark. I'm taking that orange and going right over it because I really want to have that glow for the rose. And the orange up against red does a beautiful job. If you just take white to do your highlights, it's a little bit more muted. You don't end up with that really rich glow. Orange on top of red will give it to you though. And this is why I adjusted my reference photo a bit so that I wasn't just doing it in a more magenta color, but I pulled it over towards orange on the color wheel so that I could get that warm glow. So I've got my black very, very sharpened, and I'm coming through and refining the details even more. I just used my hand to wash or brush away little pencil crumbs, and that is a bad habit to be in. If you get pencil crumbs or eraser marks or anything that you need to wipe off the paper, get one of those big drafting brushes, or even a big paintbrush would work. The drafting brushes, they're just the perfect softness so you don't end up scraping colored pencil across the paper, but use that, not your hand. Using my hand is a horrible habit. Not only am I touching the paper so the oils of my skin could get on the paper at that point, but you're more likely to smudge stuff. Now with this black, I'm pushing pretty hard on these details. I'm not using a light hand so much at this point. And really from this point on this rose, I'm not using a terribly light hand. A lot of what I'm doing is burnishing until I get to the areas where I'm doing almost a glaze, where I'm washing a color over everything. That I'll use a lighter hand. But when I'm doing these little teeny tiny details, the majority of what I'm doing now is burnishing. And this is where my really rich color starts to pop out. So I talk all the time about using a light hand, and that is good for your first layers. But there's nothing wrong with burnishing once you get towards the end of your piece. Just make sure that you really are towards the end and you know you're not going to want more layers on top of that. Once you start to burnish, you're really limiting yourself. Now, one of the things that you want to watch when you get to this stage, obviously it really looks like a rose now. It's not as much with the abstract shapes, but you still want to try to look at it as abstract shapes to get those little details in there. Just pay attention to where those shadows go. All of that makes a really big difference in your end result. While it may not seem like a big deal that you have a light area here and a dark area here and no one's going to notice the difference, in the end, it really does make it look that much more realistic if you can pay attention to where those lights and darks go. It may not look like it when you're up close, but when you back away, it sure does. One of the things that I like so much about drawing let's try that again. One of the things that I like so much about drawing flowers in colored pencil is that you get to use so many of your really bright red colors and magentas and purples and colors that you don't really use a lot in wildlife. So I think that's a lot of fun. Now notice that I put a shadow on the upper section of the inside of the rose here. How shadowed that is right there. I basically did like a glaze. I took my Polychromos and had gone over that whole upper section. I left the underside. It starts to brighten up as the rose comes down because of the way that the light is hitting it, but that upper section is darker. Using my black to define my edges a little bit more over here, building up that contrast. If you can hear people talking in the background, I apologize. I normally record these when no one else is home, but I'm getting ready for a move and a vacation. Actually, when this one goes live, I will be on vacation. So I'm having to record on days that I normally don't, and I can't get the family members to be quiet. So I'm adding a bit of a shadow underneath the rose here. I don't want to go too dark. Now, when you take your reference photos, if you do try this with the white paper and flowers that you buy yourself and take the photos outside, the lighting that you use or the lighting that of that time of day makes such a big difference. So try different times of the day. It may look great in the early morning, late afternoon, or here I did midday, but it was overcast, and so I got perfect lighting for what I wanted. So you just try different light time or different times of the day to get different lighting. Right here, this shadow is really, it was so bright outside, so there wasn't a dark shadow. It was mostly just reflecting the color of the roses onto the white paper. So I'm adding this very lightly. Once I get the base shadow on here, I'm going to blend that out with the paint thinner, and then I'm going to take the Derwent Drawing Chinese White and go over all of that. And what that will do is push all of these colors together. So it softens it, it lightens it up, but it also brings these colors so nicely together to where it doesn't look like I've got heavy lines from color to color. And that's something that I do a lot when I do portraits. I actually think that Derwent Drawing Chinese White is going to be amazing for portraits, for getting smooth skin tones. But just layering that white on top of something that you want really smooth really does give you nice results. So I'm blending that with the paint thinner. Now, one thing that I had to do here, every time I had to blend up against the white paper with the paint thinner, is take that brush, rinse it out really well in the paint thinner, and wipe it off on my paper towel. Again, I use Viva paper towels or an old t-shirt. Regular, like Bounty paper towels will not work well with the paint thinner. It just kind of soaks in wrong. So, but what I had to do is make sure that that brush was clean. Now, paint thinner, it's a brush cleaner, so you don't need to use soap and water or anything like that, but I needed to make sure that any other colored pencil pigment that I had from previous blending was off that brush, because if it wasn't, I could get a brush mark in completely the wrong area and on that white paper. If I had done that, there would be nothing I could do to fix it. That just, I'd have to draw a leaf or random something there to hide it, but that would have been there. So make sure when you're doing that up against, blending color right up against paper that you're going to leave white, clean your brush really well before you touch the brush to the paper. So now I'm taking another Luminance pencil. This one, I've got my pencils right next to me, so I'm trying to pull them up and let you guys know what colors I'm actually using. That color is apricot. Hey, that one was easy enough to read and pronounce. But this is another one that's fairly opaque. It's an orangey color, and I'm able to pull out a lot of highlights on here. I don't like to use white too much for the highlights because white ends up with so much pink, and here I wanted that orange glow. But a really nice opaque luminance here. And you can see, I mean, a lot of people halfway through this rose, or where I would have called it my 3/4 mark or my halfway mark, would call it finished. Okay, I've got colored pencil covering everything, but it would have looked flat. I wouldn't have had the color saturation. It just would be missing so much. If you can keep working and working and working and layering that color, you can get such great richness in your tones. One of the dark colors that I'm using here too, I'm using both the dark red, but the really dark one that I'm using right there is the, I'm not going to say this right, it's caput mortuum violet. Mortuum, I don't know how to say it. That one's the Polychromos. It's listed below in the video description. But that one's really good for some of these dark areas on the red as well. You can see I've got the really sharp pencils again, and I'm just cleaning up edges, adding shadows, which adds so much more dimension to the rose. So again, good lesson. Don't think you're finished too soon. Chances are if you keep on working on something, you can make it look that much better. That Derwent Drawing Chinese White, I believe it's a wax-based pencil, but part of it almost feels like working with oil pastels in that it's so thick and so opaque. So you can see I've gone right over my entire shadow here, and look how nice and soft that is now. Throwing in a bit more shading. And then I'm burnishing on top of that with the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. I didn't even need to blend that with a paint thinner. I just burnished over it. And the highlights I added on this rose with the white, just not very much. And I'm not completely finished. I'm going to come back to that rose and add a few highlights and touch-ups later after I get the roses next to it done. I'm always so impressed by people when they work where they can finish one square inch at a time. My brain just does not work that way. I love watching the work done in that manner, though. So I've started with that base. It's a yellowy green color. Then put the greens on top, blended that with paint thinner. Now when you're doing a lot of the teeny tiny little detail like this, it can get really tedious and you may find yourself getting bored and wanting to go do something else or losing interest. I strongly recommend audiobooks. That's pretty much how I'm able to sit and work for so many hours straight, is I've always got a story that I'm listening to. But if you can get lost in the story, you'll lose time, and I just find that I get so much more work done that way. Plus for me, because I work so many hours where I basically have a full-time job editing video and doing the business side of art, and then at night there's the other full-time job of drawing. But I don't feel like I work nonstop because of those audiobooks. It almost feels more like downtime. So I've blocked those in. These areas need to dry before I can move on, so I'm going to switch over to another leaf. I'm working in little circles, and I'm letting each of those little circles that I'm doing overlaps over the next so that I get more solid coverage. It looks almost like I'm scribbling side to side, back and forth, and that is very rarely how I work the colored pencil. It is normally little circles or little ovals that are overlapping to get a lot of smooth coverage. But because of how fast these videos move, it looks like I'm just scribbling side to side. Like I said, that's not what I'm doing. I'm missing a bit of the video there, but it's the same thing that I've done everywhere else. I just kept layering and then blended out with paint thinner. While that area dries, I'm moving on to the next leaf. Now, one of the reasons that I don't work my pencil side to side in that kind of scribbly motion is it makes it really hard to blend out those lines. Sometimes you end up with lines that just you do not want to come off the paper no matter how many layers you put on top of them. So that's why working in smaller circles or little ovals where each of the lines that you're making or the little circles you're making are overlapping, it just helps you to get more solid coverage, which helps you to avoid the problem of having scribble lines. So I've layered down the lighter colored greens first, and I'm just taking that darker green and going over my shadowed areas. I'll end up coming back through with black to darken up the shadowed areas even more, but I don't want to go too dark too soon. It's better if I go lighter than I'm going to end up needing to be than to go too dark and have to try to lighten it. And these stages are always a bit scary looking because it does look like a children's coloring book at this stage. But you want to just keep working and layering until it looks good. Usually, if it looks like crayon, it's just because you haven't finished. Now, I know a lot of artists will tell you how you have to, every little thing has to be perfect. If one thing is off, you need to take a razor blade and chip it out, which is weird, and I wouldn't want to damage my paper that way, but whatever. Here's the thing. Most of your viewers, as long as you're close, they're not going to notice. If you've got something, if you're like, oh my gosh, that black just got a little bit on my rose, all I'm going to do is thin out my rose a little bit in that area. You can correct things to where no one is ever going to notice the difference. So on a portrait, you can't get away with that as easily, but I mean, on something like this, don't stress yourself out. If you accidentally get a color where you didn't want it, just thin that area out, add an extra leaf. I mean, you can fix things, and your viewers more often than not are not going to notice the difference. So a lot of what I've seen advice that has been given to other artists, and it seems like it just makes the whole process very stressful. Don't stress out about it. Have fun. There are different things that you can do to fix problems, whether that's adding an extra leaf because something went where it wasn't supposed to, thinning an area out, or just using an ink eraser, erasing an area, and then going on top of it with pencil again. There's a lot of things that you can do. It's not brain surgery. I mean, if something's a little off, nobody's going to die. Have fun with it. You're going to learn a lot faster if you're having fun than if you're stressing out about every little line that you make, every little detail. Just a quick little lesson in, if you worry too much about everything being perfect, you get nothing done. The band that I used to play in, my last band, the musicians were amazing. It was folk music, and they were absolutely amazing. But the lead singer, because everything had to be perfect, we never got anything accomplished. We would record, and he would just find the littlest things that no one would have ever noticed. And he would never move forward because of it. He was always hung up on every little teeny tiny thing he did. Had to be so super perfect. And it's like no one really got to enjoy his music because he never got anything finished recording. He never accomplished anything because of it. As talented as he was, it didn't matter. No one was going to get to enjoy it. So I think it's really the same thing with art. A lot, little teeny minor mistakes that you may not like, most people are not going to notice. They're still going to enjoy your work. Do the best you can, but have fun with it. Sometimes it's just an issue too of learning, okay, I'm not going to do that, make that mistake on my next piece, but still finish the piece you're working on because you're still completing a piece of art that somebody's going to love. So I've blocked in my colors, my little abstract shapes, blending that out with paint thinner. Now that the other leaf is dried, what I did, I just touched the paper to feel if it was dry. Now that that leaf is dry, I can go back over it here. This is a good example of a very ugly stage. That yellow that I was using, that Luminance yellow, is fairly opaque. I mean, more so than a Polychromos Luminance would have been. So I was able to basically lighten up that green without having to use white. White is going to give you a more muted, foggy look. And by using the yellow, it kept that green very rich. And I'll still use white for some of this anyway. But in this case, it really worked for keeping that green very green. You can see I started out blending that with the smaller brush, realized that was going to take way too long, and switched over to my larger filbert. Now, someone had commented recently that it seems like I always know which colors to use. In part, yeah, part of that is experience. But in part, I'm not stressing out about it. As long as my values are right, that's what I care about. If I start using a color and I think, oh, that doesn't look good, I'm just going to switch colors. It's not necessarily that everything I do is the perfect color all the time. Everything with art, there's so much experimentation. But I'm not afraid to experiment. Like here, I just put a line in the wrong place. I know I can kind of fix it and adjust stuff. So if I need a dark color, I just grab a dark pencil. If it didn't look right, I'm going to grab another one and layer on top. I do test out on another piece of paper first if I'm really not sure what something's going to come out like. But so often the colors and the layering process, along with just experience and practice, is experimentation. As always, the main thing I'm focusing on is making sure my values are what they should be. The colors are a secondary concern. Because you can layer these colored pencils so many times too. Even if you are very picky and you want every single color to be exact, you can do enough layering to adjust just about any layer you put down. You can keep layering and adjust that color to just about anything you would want. One of the nice things with colored pencil, while it is a very slow medium, the fact that it's a slow medium means it's a lot harder to make big mistakes. In acrylic painting or oil painting, you can move along so fast that you can make pretty big mistakes very quickly before you even realize you made those mistakes. Like, oh my gosh, my nose is lopsided, whatever it is. With colored pencil, you're working so slow that chances are you're going to catch any of those mistakes fairly early on and be able to adjust them. So while with painting or with acrylic and oils, they're very forgiving. You can just paint over the area. You can't do that as easily with colored pencil, but because you're working so slow, it's pretty easy to catch any of those mistakes before they turn into a disaster. So these roses are pretty much exactly like the first rose. I'm layering down those two lighter colors first. Then I'm just shading on top of it. Once I get all of that shading in, I'm going to use the Mona Lisa. Actually, no, this rose I was using Gamsol for blending. The Gamsol, just like the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, has no odor. Here, just watching my reference photo closely, paying attention to where my lights and darks are going to go. Had a little bit of green still on that brush, so I've got to wash it off with the paint thinner before I blend out again. That's one mistake I have got to start watching better, because I've caught myself doing it a few times where I had the wrong color, like a green or a blue, and I went to blend an orange and made a big smudge on the paper. Luckily, I'm able to layer enough colors over it to fix it, but it is something that you want to watch. Make sure that you rinse your brush out in paint thinner when you work from one zone to another and wipe it off on your paper towel. If you can get in the habit of doing that, it'll make your life much easier. Now, one of the things that makes the rose, the leaves on the rose, appear to be curved and wrapped around the center of the rose is that all of these curves actually are rounded. If you look at the line that I previously had, let's see, I'm pointing at the screen, but that does you guys no good. But kind of right next to where I'm working now, over to the left, that row, it's almost like a little line that is a sideways L, I guess. That one, notice how it's curved. It's not just a straight line. All of these lines I'm working in here, see how they're all curved towards the inside center. That helps give you the depth and the dimension, the curve of the rose. Make sure you don't have a bunch of straight lines in there. You do a bunch of straight lines, it's going to look very flat. They curve and they overlap. It's almost like following a circle if you were to put a circle in the very center of the rose and just follow the curves all the way out. So I'm using that darker pencil. That's the caput mortuum something that I really should learn how to say because I use that color all the time. But that one I use just to line out all of the darks on the center. Adding my next layers on this larger outer petal. Again, when you looked at this petal, it appeared to be white. Like when you looked at it in person, it was white on the outside. But because it's up against that red rose next to it, or the inside of that red, is reflecting onto this outer white section. So it's fairly dark. I'm going to lighten it up quite a bit with white on top of it. But it's still, like I said, it looked like it was white in person, but when you actually start working on these and you use your eyedropper tool to check your color, they're not, white is very rarely white. I keep having people ask about using baby oil or rubbing alcohol to blend their pencils. I don't recommend it because of archival issues, and baby oil doesn't play nice with paper. I mean, it's an oil on paper. It's not going to dry right. You're not going to be able to blend and layer the same way. Yes, it will blend the pencils, but I just do not recommend it. I want to make sure that my work lasts, and I don't trust that to be the case when using baby oil because of how it reacts to the paper, or the paper reacts to it, however you want to look at it. When you use the odorless mineral spirits, it dries very quickly, so you're able to layer right away. With the baby oil, because it's not really going to dry right, you can't work your pencil over it without damaging the paper. I think for those who are doing card crafts and more of craft type things, it's not a big deal because I see a lot of crafters use that. But when you're doing a fine art where you want this to last, you've really got to be careful about which supplies that you're using. Now, anything that it is that you're drawing, whether it be water or roses or skies, anything, all it is copying your photo. Pay attention to the shapes in your photo. They're just shapes. Shapes and shadows. Simplify it like that and you can draw anything. You're just copying shapes. So it really doesn't matter what the subject is you're drawing, as long as you can get used to copying those shapes, whatever shapes it is that you're seeing. And that's something that's going to come easier with time. And the longer that you're painting or drawing, the more detail you're going to start noticing in your work. I remember years ago when I first started doing pet portraits, I was drawing studio assistant #1 all the time. And my work was it was okay. It was not terribly realistic. And I remember seeing another artist's work, and it looked like a photograph of the dogs that she was doing. The difference between hers and mine was she was able to notice the little details that I just wasn't seeing. I was skipping over. I wasn't paying attention to them. I had to start training my brain to notice those. So it wasn't something that like I had it or I didn't have it to start with. I had to teach my brain to notice those details, and that comes with time and practice. So if you ever feel like your work is not realistic enough, you're never going to get there, you will. Trust me, I was right there with you not that long ago. You just have to train your brain to see all of these things. And you'll get to where everywhere you go, you could see a park bench and you're going to start noticing details that you never noticed before. As artists, when you work in realism, you see the world in a very different way than everybody else. And a lot of that, again, you're just training your brain to see things that way. So definitely don't be frustrated or kick yourself because you don't think it's realistic enough. You'll get there. So these bigger leaves you can see, or bigger petals, I'm shading them all individually, adding some of those lights and darks. And I'm not worried about any of this being perfect. I don't care if that's the exact right color in that exact right area, as long as my values are close. Plus, a lot of this I already know I'm going to layer over it later, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time worrying about every teeny little color being the exact right in the exact right spot. I'm going to layer over later, so if something doesn't look right, I will fix it later on. For me, so much of what I do is figuring out ways that I can do things quickly. Take your time as needed. It's not about rushing, but it's about figuring out what you need to spend a ton of time on and what isn't going to be that big of a deal. So the inside here, I already have my darks blocked in, and then I just lightly went over that with the colored pencil so that it's all shaded in. Adding a bit more shading before I go through all of this with the paint thinner. You can see at this stage my colors are very dull, especially if you compare this to the other one. And I posted this on Facebook while I was working on it. I had gotten about halfway, 3/4 of the way through with this rose and posted it to show how muted and dull the colors are here. But that's because it's not finished. I'm just going to continuously work on it until I clean everything up and get the richness that I want in the colors. So I've got to let that dry. While that dries, I came over here and started working again on the leaves next to it. Now, one of the things that can help you progress even faster in your artwork, if you've got friends or family, kids, anybody that you can teach, I mean, Girl Scout troops love to have someone come in and teach them how to do any sort of arts or craft. But if you can go and start teaching, you will learn so much faster. When you have to actually explain the process to people, it really does help. And even if that's for kids, I mean, they're going to love it and it's going to benefit you. But being able to, because what's going to happen is it's going to force you to start noticing things where they're having a problem with their artwork and you've got to troubleshoot and figure out how to fix it. And that is just going to improve your artwork that much more. So if you know anybody who's interested in artwork that you can kind of work with and show them how to do what you know how to do, it really will make a big difference in your work. I don't think I would have progressed to the stage that I have in that amount of time had I not been teaching so early on. I started teaching preteens and teenagers, and it was just acrylic painting, but when you're constantly figuring out what went wrong on their piece, it helps you when you are doing your own stuff. You can see those colors, my first layers, it is so muted, very gritty. My colors are not rich at all, but that's okay for that stage. Now for these darker shadows, I am pushing a little bit harder on the pencil here. Now figuring out how hard you need to put on, how much pressure to apply to your pencil, that is going to come from practice and experience. Just try different methods, see what happens. If you're pushing too light and not much color is coming out on the paper, try pushing a little bit harder. If you get to the point where the paper is not taking enough layers, then you know you're pushing too hard. But it's one of those things that I keep saying, use a light hand. That's a very subjective term, so you've got to practice on your own to see how light you really need to push or how much pressure you can apply before you start damaging that paper. So that is the scarlet color that I'm going over all of that with, which gives that beautiful glow. I love that pencil. Now with the white, the Derwent Drawing Chinese white here, I'm doing this in streaks, which helps create some of the veining in that petal. Again, I don't want to go too crazy with the veins here though, because I don't want that to be the focus of attention. I want the inside of the roses to be where the viewer is drawn. But I can still create a little bit of texture there. You can see how nicely this comes through and just lightens everything up. The nice thing with that pencil, while you do burn through it very quickly, it's really inexpensive. I know it's under $2. I forget how much it was. I ordered it from dickblick.com. I've got to let the flower dry, so I'll go and do some touch-ups on the leaves around it again. And there's that more opaque orange color that I was using earlier. That is the apricot. You can see how it just pulls out a little bit of highlights without being too foggy like I would have gotten with the white. The little details, I've switched over to my Luminance white. I'm using the Derwent pencil extenders. Those are so comfortable to use. I've used the General's pencil extender in the past, and well, Luminance don't fit in that one anyway, but it had this weird metal ring around part of it, and it really hurt my hand to work with. This one's very comfortable, and I'm able to use almost every last, I get down to like ½ an inch on that pencil with using this pencil extender. I have several sets of these, but realistically, I really only need one for my Luminance white and one for my black Polychromos. Those are the only pencils that I generally burn down really low. They're about, I think it was about $8 at Hobby Lobby, and then of course you've got the 40% coupon. They're a little bit more on their website and a little bit more on dickblick.com, but totally worth the money. I know some people will try to glue the end of a small pencil onto different rods and sticks. That is just way too much work and way too much trouble for me. It's nice with these extenders because you just pop them in and out as you need. So if it's an issue of you only have one set of the extenders, because you will need, it comes in a 2-pack, you do need the 2 different sizes if you're using both Luminance and Polychromos, being that they are different sizes, but you can just pop them in and out quickly if you're switching between colors. You don't have to have a whole lot of sets of them to get good use out of them. I'm taking that apricot color and I've added a little bit into the green leaves just to mute them a little bit so they're not too green. It gives that nice gold color. Then I'm taking this bright green and going over the base of that flower. Don't want to go too crazy with it. Now I'm using a pretty light hand to go over with this green because I don't want that to be too harsh. Now, one of the reasons that I chose this bouquet of roses when I was looking for roses to draw is the edges were just slightly frayed, slightly, just a teeny touch of almost black brown along the edges where it was starting to dry and curve, and it just made for such a beautiful photo. So you can see as I go around these with this really dark color, it's almost like I'm outlining or bordering them. The thing is, don't do a straight line here. It's kind of rigid. It's bumpy, and that's just going along the outside, that ruffled look of the flower. But it helps in creating even more contrast and more depth and having that harsh contrast there. Now, when you're doing reference photos like this, I did use my DSLR to get the photos, which is really nice for using with the macro lens to get the fine detail. But when you're just going with reference photos, honestly, for something like this, because the subject's not moving, you could use your cell phone camera and get decent photos. So you can get reference photos yourself if you do get a bouquet of roses from somebody or go buy your own. So there I'm using that really dark, that is the perylene brown, I believe. It's a reddish, dark brick red type color with the Luminance. But look, as I start building these up, that color is flat and muted on the inside of the rose. And as I start adding this contrast, all of these fine details, and making these colors richer, look how it just starts pulling everything out and making it look so much more realistic. So again, like I was talking about earlier, just continuing to work. If it doesn't look good, keep layering and working on it until it does. As long as you're not pushing too hard too early on, you're fairly unlimited with these, with how many layers you can do. And by unlimited, I mean you can easily get 20 or so layers. I guess that is a limit. So anywhere where I've put black, I'm taking that perylene brown, which I'm probably saying wrong, but I'm taking that and going over it so that my black isn't flat. The other thing that you want to watch is when you're using black up against white, you're going to mix gray, which is going to give you an ugly, foggy look. So it's really important here for me to come back through in between those edges with another color and just pull out that color, make it more rich. I do want to say too, whatever techniques I'm using, they work for me. If you find that you like to layer in another way, if it works for you, don't let anyone tell you it's wrong, as long as you're happy with the results. If you're unhappy with the results, then yeah, you may want to look for alternatives. But if you found a way that you like to layer and you love the way that it looks, there's nothing wrong with that. I've heard from people where people will tell them that you can't use an eraser when you're working on graphite or blending tools and it's not as good or something's wrong with that. If you like the results you're getting, what difference does it make? So here, as much as I tell you do this, don't do that, if it works for you to do those things I tell you not to do, go for it. As long as it's not damaging the archival quality of your work, I don't think it matters. So I had added the white so that I got the highlights, but I didn't want to leave it white. So I'm taking the Polychromos white, or Polychromos, the reds and pinks, and going over it so it's like a glaze, tinting that color. So I've still got the lightness, the brightness of the white underneath where I needed to pull highlights back out, but I didn't want it to stay white, so that's where I did a sort of glaze with the Polychromos on top of it. Now I'm going to blend that out with the paint thinner, and this is going to mute the colors again, so I'm not finished. I will go back over them again and keep layering and adding more until I get it where I want it. And I'm starting to get to where to the point of this where I will start burnishing on a lot of these flower petals. Now that I've got my base layers in. So while that portion of the rose dries, I'm going to go ahead and block in my shadows. I'm using a very light hand because up against that white paper, if I go too dark, even though I've got the white, the Derwent Drawing Chinese white, I can go over it, I still need to be really careful not to go too dark too soon. I'm working in teeny tiny little circles to make sure that I don't have any heavy pencil lines. I will have a real-time video of this up over on my Facebook page, so if you do want to see the way that I'm layering and how I do these little circles, it'll be up over there for you guys. Now for drawing out my rose, I used a 4H pencil and a very light hand. Make sure when you're drawing stuff, especially if you're going to be up against white, don't use heavy lines with a dark pencil for drawing that because it is really hard to get rid of those lines. I don't need to erase my lines as I work. I just draw them out really light in the first place. But this is going to be especially important if you're drawing white flowers. For colored pencil, I really don't like using tracing and transfer paper because the transfer paper always comes out a bit too dark and it's sometimes really hard to get rid of those lines or to work them into your work. So I prefer just to use that 4H graphite pencil. And if you don't want to freehand it, you can just take your paper, tape it with masking tape up against your computer screen and trace it that way. That way you have a lot more control of how thick that line is. When I'm using paint, I love the tracing and transfer paper, but with colored pencil, that transfer paper, the lines are always too thick and they don't erase, so I avoid that here. So I'm going to let that dry. I will go back over it when that dries with the Derwent Drawing Chinese white. And that flower isn't finished. I still have touch-ups and highlights to do, but I'm going to let all of that dry and set while I work on the next flower. So I'm starting again with the white portion of the outer edge of that flower. I am using, I told you what it was earlier, and now I don't remember. That is the burnt ochre 10%, and I'm going to layer some of the burnt sienna 10% over that. Very similar to how I do skin tones, where I layer these lighter colors. Now I'm adding some of the shadows with the Polychromos. I'm blocking in the lighter portions first, basically the white portions of the rose, which aren't actually white, but that's what color, like I said earlier, that they are in person. So we're just going to call them white. Now, just a reminder, if you're just using Polychromos, there are light areas that need to be on this flower petal here where it curves out. I would have put the lightest areas in first and then the dark around it. But if you've got your Luminance white, then you'll be able to add highlights on top of it, so you don't really need to worry about that. This was a big area here that I did not end up exact to the photo. One of my lines was off or I wasn't paying attention, but in the finished result, nobody's going to notice the difference. Throwing the orange on top of that red color, which will help give me that nice glow. One thing that I found doing 3 flowers that are all pretty close to the same, it felt like drawing the same painting 3 times. I hate painting the same painting multiple times. I used to do that when I was younger before prints were really easy. Someone would want the same painting and I would have to do it that same or a similar one. I'd always make changes so they weren't exact, but close enough that, oh, I did not enjoy that. And I kind of felt that way doing 3 roses, all the same color, all similar positions. I loved the end result, but I definitely was bored of it by this flower. Now, if you're like me, I don't recommend, if you start to get bored, don't start a new project. Make yourself finish the first project, because more often than not, you're not going to come back and finish it later. I used to do that all the time, and I have so many paintings in the garage that I had started and never finished that I'm probably just going to throw out. They're not worth the trouble of trying to repaint or gesso or finish, because it's been now, some of those out there are nearly 10 years old. My skills have improved, so it'd be easier just to start over with making better work altogether than to try to improve or fix the mess that I'd created out there on those. So yes, definitely I recommend, even if you start to get bored, keep working on it till you finish. Those audiobooks help. Now, you can see that I'm basically doing a heavy outline around these. Depending on what you're actually drawing, that may or may not be a good idea. Here, it's safe because I do need a heavy border around the edges of most of these flower petals, so it's easier for me to do that for this. But if I were doing certain animals or a portrait, that heavy line is going to be something that I want to avoid. So I don't want to give you guys the impression that you always want to outline everything heavily like this. Using that lighter color again for the white portions of the petals. You can see I'm taking these red colors and going right over the black so that that doesn't stay flat. And if you look at the other rows where I did use a lot of black on those deeper shadows, because of the colors on top of it, look how very bold, very rich that color is. I'm using the word rich way too much in this video, but you can see how nice that color is. It is not flat black. Very, very important to put another color on top of it. That gives you the deep dark color without being flat. So now that I've got those heavier outlines, I just lightly went over all of those petals. But if you are new to this, it is way easier to do one little petal at a time, because when you color over the whole section like I just did here, it can definitely start to feel a little bit overwhelming and easy to not know what area you're working on when you refer back to your reference photo. Now, I've had people ask a lot lately how to know how much detail you should draw initially in that reference photo. That's going to be a bit personal. I like to draw quite a bit of detail, but you're going to get a better idea the more you're painting and drawing. You're going to have a better idea of how much detail is useful to you, because it will hit a point where if you have too much detail in there, you can't tell what anything is anymore. So for me, I like my basic general outlines of the shapes. I can freehand in all the little stuff as I'm working. So here I'm just loosely, I'm using that filbert brush and going over everything. And you can still see all of my heavy lines that I did previously. Gotta let that dry. I tried working on it there, but it was a little wet. So I gave it a few minutes, let it dry, and then came back and started layering again. Now, as you're working on something like this, the contrast, I can't stress enough how important it is to get your contrast, your darks really dark, your lights really light, in order to make everything have that three-dimensional look. If everything's very muted, I mean, look at this rose. If I just kept it how it is now, technically it's drawn right. If I stopped here, though, look at it versus the other rose. It doesn't have any contrast. Besides the fact that it's boring to look at, it's very flat. Because it's missing the contrast, it's missing all of the shading that I need to do. So it's not just about having a good drawing, because the drawing is fine. That drawing is very accurate, but it looks terrible because it doesn't have contrast. My values aren't in there yet. And remember, I know a lot of people freak out about trying to choose which color it is. They're so worried about choosing the right color. The color is not that big of a deal. It's all about your contrast. Having your darks the right value and your lights the right value. That's what's going to make a big, big difference in your work. There was an artist who was drawing or painting Italian greyhounds at the same time when I was really focused on pet portraits. And her drawings were amazing. They were so super accurate. The detail in her work was incredible, but everything was mid-range. It was very boring to look at because she didn't have her lights light enough or her darks dark enough. And so if you were to look at her work versus take somebody else whose drawing wasn't quite as good as hers, but they had the contrast, it's the artist with the contrast that most people were going to be drawn to. So all the work in the world of making your drawing absolutely perfect, if you are afraid to get your values, your darks dark and your lights light, the work is going to be very boring to look at. It's going to look flat. One of the things that I want to encourage you to do, if you are on any of the social media platforms where you've got a lot of artists sharing their work, pay attention to the art that you're drawn to the most. More likely than not, it's the art that has the high contrast. It's just bold, the darks are super dark, the lights are super light, and everything in between, versus something that's well drawn and more muted. But definitely start paying attention to what you're drawn to. If you can go to a gallery that displays amateurs' work, you'll see a lot of that, where everything's very flat. But when you're walking around, when you see that work with that high contrast, that's what you're going to go to. So here again, you can see on that petal I was just working on, I had that outer edge where it's darker, it's almost outlined. But notice that the outline isn't even all the way across. I'm not just doing a thick border around the edge. Portions of it, that darker color comes in farther. Some of it is out really skinny. So there's a lot of variation in that outline that I did on that petal, which helps to make it look more realistic and not just like a cartoon that I've outlined the edges. That's really important when you're doing edges like this where you do have that border, is making sure that you get the variation. An even line all the way across on any of these petals really would make it look very, very fake. In so much of what you paint and draw, the variation is really important. If you're doing bushes, flowers, trees, grass, all of that, if everything is too uniformed, it doesn't look natural. It looks very stiff, very fake. If you can get variation in there, that is going to make a really big difference in your work. So this is a really good stage to, again, notice how gritty this is, where it has that very crayon feel. It is totally normal for your work at the earlier stages to have that look. So if it looks like that, don't freak out. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just a part of the layering process when you work in layering the way that I do. I'm taking that orange back over this again to help me get that richer, that more glow. My grammar is amazing. Sorry for those of you who are trying to understand what the heck it is I'm saying. So I'm blending that out again with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. I believe I switched back to the Mona Lisa this time just because the container I had it in is easier for me to access. The Gamsol, I was just working straight out of the little bottle it comes in. The nice thing with the Gamsol is it does come in such a little bottle, you don't have to put it in a separate container to use it. Remember, when you are working with the odorless mineral spirits, keep the lid on it when you're not actually using it. Like here, I blended it out, I put the lid back on, and I'm going to leave the lid on until I use it again. I'm not going to leave the lid open the entire time I work that night, because even though it is odorless, it's still toxic, but I've not had any problems, and I'm pretty sensitive to toxic fumes. I get really bad headaches, but I've never had a problem with the Mona Lisa odorless, or again now with the Gamsol. You can see on these layers I'm starting to push a little bit harder on the pencil, but I'm towards the end so I can get away with that. Taking that scarlet color and going over that as well. Anywhere I've got the black, I'm really going over now with the reddish colors so that the black isn't actually black. So here still, as nice as and deep as the colors are on this flower, at this point it's very flat because I don't have the highlights in yet on the red portions. So you can see still, as much work as I've done, it is just not done. So you don't want to call it finished too early. Keep layering until it looks how you want it to look. The biggest mistake that I see in people's art, there's two big mistakes. One, they start with an inaccurate drawing. Make sure that drawing is right before you ever start. The second one, and the biggest of everything, is that they don't finish the work. It's not that anything's bad or wrong, it's that it's just not finished. So keep layering until it looks exactly how you want. You can see I'm using that apricot color again to pull out some of the highlights. Now this will have to dry before I can really come on top with the white over the white portions of the flower. And one of the reasons that I chose this rose, besides I loved the border, the edges of the flowers, having the dark edges like it does, but having the white on the outside and the red on the inside, it just made for such an interesting drawing, having so much contrast. It was really easy to have that high contrast. If they were just solid red roses, they'd be pretty, but it wouldn't draw the viewer in as much as the contrast that I have between the white on the outside and the red on the inside. So keep that in mind. If you go to the store shopping for flowers to draw, consider what that's going to look like as artwork. It's very similar to reference photos. Someone may have a really cute photo of their dog, but that doesn't mean it's going to translate great into artwork. So when you're looking for reference to work from like this, same thing even with the flowers. Just because it's a pretty flower, it doesn't mean it's going to look as good as a different type of flower once translated into art. So I'm pulling out highlights, but I'm not pushing too hard because I don't want this to be white. I just want it to be a bit lighter. I really want to avoid using too much white on the red highlights, just because it mutes the color so much. Now I've got to come back through and hype up the darks even more as well. They're kind of muted right now. So you can see I'm using the white first, but I'm not going too crazy with that. Now when you've got rose petals where they're curved out like this larger one on the outer edge, make sure you get your shadows in the right place because that is going to give it the look of that petal being curved. If it's one solid color all the way through, it's going to look very flat. Even if it's drawn exactly the same, making sure that your highlights are in the right position where your highlights and shadows are where they should be, this is what's going to create that curved, rounded look. Pulling these darker colors out through here. And this is the Luminance, the one I can't say, the perylene brown something or another. I'm using that to go right over the black and adding additional shadows. You can see here too, especially the very center of the rose I'm working on right now. Notice how muted those colors are, the blacks, because I haven't gone on top of them with another color yet. They're just kind of foggy and dull. using a very small flat brush to blend some of that out with the paint thinner. Now, I don't always blend everything with paint thinner. A lot of my final layers, I don't use paint thinner on at all. I just burnish. My first layers, I pretty much always use paint thinner though, for maybe the first 10 layers. And when I talk about layers, I usually do for 3 to 5, I'd say, layers of colored pencil, and then I blend with paint thinner. So every time I talk about layers, I count all those 3 to 5. I don't count just every time I've blended with paint thinner 20 times. I mean 20 different layers of pencil itself, not counting how many times have been layered with paint thinner, if that makes any sense. Probably not. But I think it gives the impression that I'm doing a lot more layers than I do if you misunderstand what I mean by thinking every time I blend with paint thinner as a layer. I mean every layer of colored pencil I add, whether it's blended with paint thinner or not, those are what I'm counting as layers. So very lightly going over my shadow here. Once I blend that out, I will again let it dry and then go over it with the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. And adding the shadow here is pretty important, otherwise it will look like my roses are just floating in midair. Again, make sure when you're blending up against white, make sure that that brush is very clean before you blend, and just clean it in the paint thinner and wipe it off on your paper towel. So I've got to let that dry before I can burnish white over it. I'm taking this darker red color and going over my shadows, including the blacks. I'm going to hype up my contrast a bit more with the white. Now I'm being fairly streaky here, so I've got the hint of veins, but again, I don't want to have it too detailed with the veins because that is not where I want the viewer drawn. Cleaning up my edges with a very, very sharp pencil. They use the Luminance there because it is so opaque. It is really going to cover up anything and keep everything very clean on those edges. It looks like I'm using black, but I'm not. That is that perylene brown color again. You can see I finally took that darker red color and went over the black on the center of the flower so that those aren't flat. By really hyping up the main shadows in here. Look what a difference it starts making. Those last touch-ups on the rose is what really pulls everything together. And I like to take a photo of my work when I think I'm done, load it into Photoshop or into a photo editor on my phone, and adjust the contrast. See if it looks better if I hype up the contrast a bit more or if I tone things down. But I like to do that before I think that I'm completely finished, just in case I decide it would look better if I made some of those adjustments. But that is it for these roses. If you have any questions, let me know, preferably here on Patreon because I'm more likely to see them, although sometimes those questions still fall through the cracks, and I apologize. I'm not intentionally ignoring anybody, but definitely let me know if you have any questions.